What were the first painkillers to be used by humans, and why were they invented?
Well, the first painkillers that were in human use are obviously things that were occurring naturally. So, first recorded use of willow bark, which is where we get aspirin from. There's recordings of that being used in Hippocrates' writings, so that's about 450 BC. There's written evidence of use of morphine derivatives even before that in Chinese medicine and so forth. So as long as mankind has been suffering pain, I guess they've been looking for ways to alleviate that. And of course, natural remedies are the first sort of port of call that were available in those days.
Do all painkillers work in a similar fashion?
No, broadly speaking, there's two types of pain. There's pain which is associated with pain receptors being activated, and then there's pain that's associated with damage or disease to the nervous system. And so there are different painkillers that treat those different types of pain.
So what are the major differences in the way different painkillers work?
Well, so the pain which is associated with pain receptors are typically treated with drugs which we call non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So these would be things like aspirin falls into that, but also things like ibuprofen, which is sold over the counter as Nurofen, diclofenac, which is another commonly prescribed painkiller. So those would be to treat pain, like for example, toothache or headaches, vague muscle pain, that kind of thing.
Are all painkillers addictive, or do they vary on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, absolutely. There are some painkillers which are extremely addictive, some of which are natural, and there are obvious examples of those, things like the opiate alkaloids, derived drugs like morphine and so forth. Those are all highly addictive. But there are also some synthetic painkillers which have been man-made, which can also lead to dependencies. But there are also other drugs which don't show any kinds of dependencies. So, for example, I don't think there's any dependency issues associated with aspirin or ibuprofen.
When in history did the popular painkillers we all know, such as aspirin, ibuprofen and paracetamol, begin to emerge?
Okay, so aspirin is a modified version of salicylic acid, which is a naturally occurring chemical that's found in the bark of the willow tree. And that was converted into, in the late 1800s, into the molecule we call aspirin by a simple acetylation reaction. That was done by some German chemists. It just makes the molecule more active by making it more soluble and easily transported around the body. So people have been using natural aspirin, as I said, or the natural salicylic acid for as long as we've got sort of written records, but the aspirin that we take today is not isolated from the willow bark. That's obviously not a sustainable way to access that. You don't have to chop down willow trees to get the compound. So instead we manufacture that chemically.
Are there any dangers associated with regular and seemingly safe doses of these drugs?
Well, with any drug there are potential side effects and you have to be aware of those. So aspirin causes problems particularly with causation, aggravation of gastric ulcers, and so you have to be careful with that. Paracetamol is another, it's a synthetic drug, again it's created in the late 1800s, commonly used for treatment of mild pain, but if taken in large amounts that can cause liver damage, and even if you take large enough amounts that can be fatal, the damage that's caused by paracetamol. So as with any pharmaceutical or drug molecule, then you need to take that under medical advice and follow the instructions that are given.
So what are the effects on the body of an accidental overdose of these popular painkillers?
Well, it varies really from from painkiller to painkiller. So as I say, paracetamol is particularly known to cause liver damage. It gets metabolized in the liver to a number of harmful chemicals which cause severe damage to the liver. So paracetamol can be very dangerous in large amounts, but it will vary for each specific drug. They'll each have different modes of action. An excess dose of them would have different effects, and of course they're also metabolized in the body in different ways as well. And it's often the metabolites which cause the toxic side effects, and that's certainly the case for paracetamol.
What about painkillers which are not typically available over the counter, such as morphine?
Okay, so morphine belongs to the opiate class of painkillers, so they act on receptors in the brain. So these are used to treat the kinds of pain which are associated with damage to the nervous system. So very powerful painkillers. So morphine itself is a naturally occurring compound. It's isolated from poppy seeds, as is I think pretty well known. There's about 500 tons of morphine are harvested every year for legitimate medical uses. Some of that is administered as morphine, but also we derive semi-synthetic drugs from morphine by carrying out simple chemical interconversions. So some of those would be known to you as things like heroin is one derivative, but there are also dihydromorphine is another clinically used drug which is derived from morphine naturally.
Where is morphine legally sourced to a very pure medical standard?
So the particular poppy that morphine is isolated from is not found in the UK naturally. It's found typically in Asia, so in countries like Afghanistan. So the legal production of morphine extracts is a legitimate business for and a large business for a number of countries in that region. But once isolated, what we do is we extract the number of natural compounds that occur within the poppy seeds. Those are extracted and brought to the UK as mixtures, which are then separated and purified into the individual components by pharmaceutical companies. So that would include morphine, but also the naturally occurring drug codeine, which is available in a number of over-the-counter applications, is also isolated from poppy seeds.
Do you actually need poppies in order to synthesize morphine, or can it be developed entirely artificially in the laboratory?
Well, that's a good question. So unlike aspirin, which is a relatively simple molecule, and these days we make it from petrochemically derived compounds because it's easier to make synthetically than it is to isolate from the natural material. In contrast, morphine is quite a complex molecule. It's an alkaloid natural product, and it's got a fairly complex structure. And although chemists have learned how to make morphine completely synthetically, we've only achieved that about 9 times, I think, the first recorded instance being in the 1950s. But none of the 9 total syntheses of morphine to date are anything like efficient enough to be able to compete with the growth of the poppies and the extraction of those poppy seeds as a source of morphine. It's just not efficient enough. So the answer is yes, we can make it synthetically, but commercially it doesn't make sense to do so.
Are there any examples of painkillers that are better off synthesized in the laboratory using man-made techniques, or are natural sources generally better?
Well, as I said, the example of aspirin, we now make that synthetically. We wouldn't strip willow trees of their bark to try and isolate the salicylic acid from them. As I said, there are also what we call semi-synthetic opioids. So that's where we take molecules like morphine and we perform relatively simple chemical transformations on them, converting them to compounds such as heroin, which have different therapeutic profiles. But there are also a number of compounds which are called synthetic opioids. So these are fully synthetic compounds, and actually structurally, if you look at those, they don't look anything at all like morphine. But what they do is they still act at the same biological receptors, the opioid receptors in the brain. So they're targeting the same receptors that morphine would target. But these are fully synthetic molecules, and so compounds of this type are compounds you may have heard of, like, for example, fentanyl, which is a very strong painkiller. It's about 50 times more potent than heroin, and pethidine is another one, and that's commonly administered during labour, child labour.
Can you tell us about the epibatidine story?
Okay, so epibatidine is a fascinating example. So this is again a naturally occurring compound. It's actually found in the skin secretions of a poison frog in South America. And this kind of family of frogs is they're known as poison dart frogs because local native tribes would dip arrow tips into the isolated skin secretions of these frogs and use it in hunting to kill their prey. And so obviously the compounds that are responsible for this are very toxic, but they're also extremely potent biological agents. The particular frog in question produces a compound, epibatidine, which is extremely toxic, causes paralysis and death, but at very low doses is found to be actually a potentially useful painkiller. It's got a similar kind of potency, in fact it's more potent than morphine, but it interestingly acts at a completely different set of receptors. Now, the problem with epibatidine as a medical lead is that it's isolated in minute quantities from the skins of these frogs. And so in terms of sustainability, it's really not sustainable to harvest thousands of frogs to isolate very, very small amounts of this material. So there were a number of chemical programs launched worldwide to investigate syntheses of epibatidine. It's a simple enough alkaloid that we can make it synthetically, and large amounts of effort went into this. Unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, clinical trials into these derived compounds have stopped now because they're just too toxic to be potentially useful as drugs. But it's an interesting example of how synthetic chemistry can enable us to explore whether some of the gifts from nature, like epibatidine, might be useful drugs in the future.
So, to what extent would you say alcohol is a painkiller?
Well, I don't think medically you'd advocate the use of alcohol as a painkiller. It's a central nervous system depressant, and so I'm sure many people will have experienced perhaps injuring themselves after a couple of drinks and perhaps not realising the pain they've caused until the next day. But I don't think that alcohol would be prescribed clinically as a painkiller. For one thing, its other side effects are far too great to be able to tolerate that.
So what about cannabis as a painkiller? Because that's certainly used in parts of the world as a medical painkiller.
Yeah, so again, cannabis acts on receptors in the brain, and the active ingredients in cannabis, tetrahydrocannabinol is the primary one of those, but also cannabidiol. Those are very potent painkillers. They also relieve symptoms such as spasticity, so stiffness in muscles, and spasms, which can be associated with diseases like multiple sclerosis. So there is in fact a commercially available extract of cannabis which is administered as a spray, and the drug is known as Sativex, and that's licensed for use in the UK. It depends which part of the UK that you live in whether you can actually access this, but I believe it's provided for multiple sclerosis sufferers who live in Wales through the National Health Service for Wales.